The bell above the study door had not been rung in 11 weeks, and when it rang now, Isolde did not flinch. She set the pen down first. She blotted the ink. She closed the ledger over the column she had been balancing and pressed the leather flat with the heel of her hand, as if the numbers inside might otherwise escape and betray her. Only then did she rise, and only then did she allow herself to feel the child move, low and certain, under the ribbon tied high beneath her breasts. 6 seconds, she thought. He gives me 6 seconds to be ready. She counted them. She was ready in 4. In the corridor beyond the door came the sound she had rehearsed for since the frost broke, boots she knew the weight of, a servant's murmur, the soft complaint of a coat being taken. She smoothed the front of her gown, which no longer smoothed the way it once had, and she looked once at the window, where the March light was doing its patient work on the yew hedge, and she said, quietly, to no one, we agreed on a great many things. The door opened. He was thinner. That was the first thing. He had gone south lean and come back leaner, as if the coast had taken something from him he had not intended to spend. His hair was longer at the collar. His mouth was the same. He stopped 2 paces inside the room as a man stops at the edge of water he has not tested, and his eyes found her waist before they found her face, and stayed there a moment too long to be innocent, and moved up too slowly to be cruel. My lord, she said. My lady, he said. Neither of them moved. Behind him the door was closed by a hand she could not see, and the click of the latch was, she thought, the loudest sound in the county. He did not cross the room. He did not ask. He looked at the ledger under her palm, and at the pen in its stand, and at the small blue cup of tea she had allowed herself an hour ago, and had not finished, and he said, "You are well." It was not a question. It was the sentence of a man who had prepared several and chosen the least dangerous. "I am well," she said. "And the estate is well." "That is good," he said. He looked at the window then, because the window was safer than her waist, and he said, "The yew has grown. The yew has grown," she agreed. There was a silence in which a great deal was said, and none of it aloud. She let it hold. He did not fill it. At last he said, I was told, in a letter, that congratulations were owed. Were they? She let that sit between them like a coin on a table neither of them wished to pick up. Then she said, gently, they are owed to the house. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched the small muscle at his jaw go and come, watched the hand at his side open and close once, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. He was famously composed. He had been composed at his mother's funeral. He had been composed the day the roof of the West Wing fell in on the harvest supper, and 3 men were nearly killed. He was composed now. But she who had lived in the same house with him for 4 years, and in the same silence with him for 3 of them, knew the difference between his composure and his stillness, and this was stillness. To the house, he repeated. To the house, she said. Well then, he said. He did not sit. She did not offer. He glanced once, quickly, at the small couch beneath the window where she had been in the habit, before he left, of reading to him in the last hour of daylight, and he glanced away from it as one glances away from a lamp that has begun to smoke. May I ask, he said, when in the summer? She said. Which month? Late July, if the midwife is to be believed. And she is to be believed, he said, because she has been correct before. She has been correct before, said Isolde. She watched him do the arithmetic. She watched him not do it. Rather, she watched him decide not to do it in front of her, and she was absurdly grateful for the courtesy. He had left in the last week of October. He had been gone the length of a shortish pregnancy and a longish scandal. He would count the months later, alone, with a decanter he would not touch, and he would arrive at the number he was already arriving at now, and he would understand that either he had been wronged or he had not, and that in a household as watched as theirs, the difference between the two would have to be decided in this room, by these two people, and no one else. She watched him choose, for the moment, not to decide. "I am glad," he said, "that you are well. Thank you, my lord." "I shall change," he said, "and take some air." The road was long. The road was long, she agreed. He turned to go, and at the door he paused, with his hand on the frame, and without turning he said, "Isolde." It was the first time in 11 weeks anyone had spoken her name in this room, and she felt it land in a place she had put carefully out of the way. "Yes," she said. He said, "I am home." It was neither apology nor claim. It was a fact laid down between them like a glove neither yet knew whether to lift. "Yes," she said. "You are." He went out. She sat down. She opened the ledger again. She found the line she had been balancing. She balanced it. She did not weep. She had, over the winter, discovered a great deal about her own capacity to withhold weeping, and she had come to think of it as a small, hard skill, like the mending of a fine seam, and she practiced it now. The house had been, in his absence, the quietest it had been in a century, and Isolde had liked it. This was one of the things she had not written to him. She had written of the barley, and of the tenants' complaints, and of the leaking gutter above the chapel, which had been mended in November for less than the steward had feared. She had written of his mother's old spaniel, which had gone stiff in the hips and now slept, without permission, on the rug in the small library. She had not written of the quiet. She had not written that on the third morning after his carriage rolled south she had woken, sat up, listened, and understood that no one in the house was afraid of her. She had not written that this was new. She had not written that she had learned, at 23, married at 19, that a house in which no one is afraid of the mistress is a house in which the mistress may finally think. She had thought a great deal. She had thought while she walked the long gallery in the mornings, hands laced behind her, because that was how her father had walked when he was working something out. And her father had been a man who worked things out. She had thought while she sat with the steward, who was called Mr. Bly, and had the face of a kind horse, and went over the rents line by line, and asked, the first week, questions she had been embarrassed to ask when her husband was in the chair beside her. Mr. Bly had answered them without condescension, because Mr. Bly had a daughter of his own who kept his own small books, and he understood that a woman with a pen was not a novelty, only a nuisance to people who preferred novelties. By the second month, she was reading the rents herself and finding in 3 of them small and consistent errors that favored a tenant whose brother-in-law was, it emerged, a cousin of the outgoing bailiff. By the 3rd month she had, with a politeness that did not blunt her edge, replaced the bailiff. By the 4th, she had ordered the west field drained, over the objection of 2 neighbors and the mild alarm of Mr. Bly, and she had paid for it out of a small private income she had inherited from a godmother, and had, until then, been saving without any clear idea for what. She had not written of any of this, either. She had written, once, that she hoped he was well. He had written back, once, that he was. In between his letter and her next she had learned, from a maid who had a sister who worked in a house in the town on the coast, that he was not alone. The maid had not meant to tell her. The maid had been laying the fire, and had said something under her breath about the sister's mistress being run off her feet by the arrival of a certain party, and Isolde had waited, and the maid had, in the way of a person who has already said too much, said the rest. A young woman. Very young. Dark Singhs lodged at a cottage half a mile from the house he had taken, seen at the window in the mornings, seen at the shore in the afternoons. Seen, once, in the doorway of the house itself, laughing, Isolde had thanked the maid for the fire. She had asked the maid not to speak of it in the servants' hall. The maid, who was neither cruel nor a fool, had agreed. Isolde had sat, that evening, in the small library, with the spaniel on the rug and the fire doing its steady work, and she had permitted herself precisely 1/4 of an hour of feeling, timed by the clock on the mantel, and at the end of the quarter hour she had risen and gone to bed. She had, in that quarter hour, understood something about herself that she had not previously wished to understand, which was that she had loved him. Not in the noisy way of the poems her sister still read, in the quiet, obstinate, slightly resentful way of a woman who had been given, at 19, a life she had not chosen, and had, without meaning to, put her whole self into it, because she was the sort of person who put her whole self into things. She had loved him. Past tense had felt, at the time, like a discipline. She was not sure, now, whether it had held. She was not sure of anything, now, except the child, which had announced itself in the first week of December in a way that admitted no argument, and had ever since insisted on being counted among the household. She had told Mr. Bligh, she had told the housekeeper, Mrs. Owen, who had cried once, briefly, into a linen napkin, and had then organized. She had told the midwife in the village, who had come in on a hard frost morning, and had looked at her without pity and without gossip, and had said, "My lady, we will manage this together," and Isolde had nearly, at that, disgraced herself with tears, and had not. She had not told him. She had written the letter 3 times. She had burned it 3 times. In the end, she had asked Mrs. Owen to write to him instead, a plain servant's letter, congratulations owed to the house, an heir expected, my lady in good health, no further particulars. Respectfully, Mrs. Owen had written it in her upright hand, and had sent it with the post from the village so that it would not go under Isolde's seal. Isolde had watched the rider go from the window of the long gallery. The child had turned inside her at that moment, small and definite, as if it too had watched the rider go. He did not come to dinner. He sent word that he would take a tray in his rooms, and Isolde, who had eaten alone at the long table for 11 weeks, and had grown fond of the honesty of it, ate alone at the long table again, and did not mind. She minded a little. She ate the soup, which was watercress, and half of the fish, which was a small trout from their own water, and none of the pudding, because the child had of late developed opinions about pudding. Afterward she walked, because the midwife had said walk, and she walked in the long gallery where his ancestors watched her from their frames, with the mild disapproval of people who had not, in life, been asked to approve of anything difficult. The gallery ran the length of the south front and gave, at its eastern end, onto a small window that overlooked the stable yard, and it was at this window, on her third turn, that she saw him. He was in the yard, without a coat, in his shirt-sleeves, and he was standing at the head of the bay mare he had ridden south in October and ridden north again in March, and he was not doing anything. He was standing. The mare was blowing quietly into the palm of his hand. His head was bent. From this distance he looked, absurdly, like a boy, and Isolde felt, absurdly, an ache of tenderness she had thought she had put away for the season. She turned from the window. She did not want to be caught watching. She walked back down the gallery, and at the far end she met, coming up the stair from the hall, a small figure in a nightgown with a candle held in both hands, and a face set in the particular grave concentration of a child who has escaped a nurse. This was Perrin, the housekeeper's grandson, 6 years old and, since November, an unofficial resident of the small library, because his mother had gone to nurse a dying aunt in the north, and Mrs. Owen had, without asking anyone, installed him. Isolde had not objected. She had, in fact, come to look forward to the sound of his slippers on the gallery floor at hours he was not meant to be up. "My lady," he said, with tremendous dignity. "Perrin," she said, "you are meant to be asleep." "I heard a carriage," he said. "It came at 4, said Isolde. "I heard it in a dream," he said, which she took to mean he had heard the servants gossiping and had preferred the dream version. "Is his lordship home?" "He is home," she said. "Is he angry?" Isolde considered the question, which had been asked with the seriousness of a small person for whom the moods of large people were weather. "He is tired," she said. "Tired is not angry." "Tired is not angry," Perrin agreed, and blew out his candle with great ceremony and permitted her to walk him back to the nursery corridor and hand him off to Mrs. Owen, who came bustling in a shawl and whispered, "My lady, you should not be climbing," and Isolde said, "I climb every day." Mrs. Owen and Mrs. Owen said, "I know, my lady, that is what worries me." When she returned to her own rooms, the fire had been built up, and her maid, Tam, was laying out the wrap she liked best. And Tam did not ask, and Isolde did not tell, and they moved around each other in the practiced silence of two women who had, over a hard winter, become something a little more than mistress and maid without either of them naming it. He came at 10. She had thought he might, and she had thought he might not, and she had decided in advance not to be pleased either way. There was a knock, soft, not the housekeeper's, not the maid's, and Tam looked at her once for permission, and Isolde nodded, and Tam opened the door and curtsied and slipped out, and he came in his shirt sleeves still, with a candle in a plain brass holder, and closed the door behind him. He stopped at the foot of her bed, which she was not in. She was in the chair by the fire, in her wrap, with her feet on a low stool because the midwife had said, "Feet up," and a book she was not reading open in her lap. He looked at her feet on the stool and at the book she was not reading and at her hair, which was loose down her back, and he said, "May I sit?" She said, "Yes." He sat in the chair opposite. The fire did its work between them. Neither spoke for a while. Then he said, "I owe you a great many words." She said, "You owe me none I will demand." He said, "That is not the same as none." She said, "No, it is not." He put his hands flat on his knees, palms down, as if to keep them from doing anything foolish. He said, "I did not come tonight to ask you anything." She raised her eyebrows very slightly. He saw it. He said, "I came to tell you that whatever you say to me at any hour of the next week or the next month or the next year will be believed by me." "Ah," she said. He said, "I do not say that as a man laying down a trap. I say it because I have had 11 weeks of a long road to consider what kind of husband I have been, and I have concluded that I have been, chiefly, absent, and that a man who has been chiefly absent has forfeited his right to interrogate." She looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he began, she saw, to be afraid. She had not, before, seen him afraid in this room. It was a small, dark discovery, and she noted it and set it aside. She said, "My lord, may I in turn tell you something?" He said, "Please," she said. "The child is yours." He closed his eyes. He did not open them for what seemed a long time. When he opened them, they were wet, which she had also not seen in this room before, and he did not wipe them, which she counted, privately, in his favor. He said, "I know." She said, "You cannot know." He said, I know because you have told me. She said, that is not the same as knowing. He said, in this house, my lady, at this hour, in this chair, it is the only kind of knowing I trust. She was quiet then. The fire snapped once. She said, then we understand each other on that point. He said, we do. She said, we do not yet understand each other on any other. He said, I know. She said, good. He said, may I ask one thing? She said, one. He said, is the child well? She put her hand, without thinking, on the low round of her belly under the wrap, and she felt, obligingly, a small, sure motion answer her palm, and she said, the child is well. He said, thank God. He said it as a man says a thing he has not said to God in some time. He rose. He bowed, very slightly, and said, good night, Isolde, and went out, and closed the door behind him with the same soft click as the study latch, and she sat by the fire for another hour without opening the book. The days that followed arranged themselves around a careful, deliberate courtesy that neither of them, at first, quite trusted. He rose early, as he always had. He rode out with the steward, as he always had. But now he asked, at the door of the study, before he went, whether she had any word for Mr. Bligh, and she said, at first, no. And then, on the third morning, yes. The drainage in the west field ought to be inspected in the low corner where the old ditch runs under the hedge, because if it is not, it will silt again by June. He looked at her for a moment. He said, the west field is drained. She said yes. He said when. She said in January. He said at whose direction? She said at mine. He said with what funds? She said with mine. He said, he did not say more. He went out. That evening, at dinner, which they had begun to take together in the small dining room rather than the long one, because the long one was cold and the small one was not, he said, over the soup, which was again watercress, because the cook had decided watercress was medicinal, I inspected the west field today. She said, and he said, it is well drained. She said, good, he said, I should have thought of it in September. She said, yes, he said, I did not. She said, no, he said, thank you. She said, you are welcome. It was a small exchange. She turned it over in her mind that night as one turns a coin to see whether it rings true, and she decided that it did. In this way, in small exchanges, they began, cautiously to speak. He asked, on the 5th day, whether he might see the ledger. She said yes. He read for an hour without comment. At the end of the hour he said, you have a hand for this. She said, my father did. He said, I did not know your father. She said, no, you met him twice. He said, I remember him as a quiet man. She said, he was not quiet. He was silent around strangers. He was, at home, one of the loudest men I have known. He said, he said, I would like to have known that man. She did not answer that. She was not, yet, ready to give him her father. The house watched them. Mrs. Owen watched them with the particular vigilance of a woman who had, for 11 weeks, been in charge, and was now, without complaint, sharing the charge again. Mr. Bligh watched them with the mild relief of a steward who preferred that decisions be made by the people who owned the land. Tam watched them with the frank curiosity of a girl who had, over the winter, been told by her mistress more than any lady's maid in the county was usually told, and who was reserving judgment. Perrin watched them without knowing he was watching them. Perrin, in fact, decided on the 2nd day that his lordship was to be tested, and appeared at the door of the study during Mr. Bligh's morning report with a bowl in his arms and a very serious face. In the bowl was a frog. My lord, said Perrin. My Lord Duke of Marlwich, his lordship, who had not, in 11 weeks, been addressed by his full title by anyone he was not paying to address him by his full title, looked up. "Perrin," said Isolde from her chair by the window, "that frog is not a study frog. It is a garden frog." "It is a pond frog," said Perrin with dignity. "It is not a study frog," said Isolde. "It is not," agreed Perrin, "but I did not know where else to bring him." His lordship said, "Why did you need to bring him anywhere?" Perrin said, "Because Mrs. Owen said not in the kitchen, and Tam said not in the corridors, and the nurse said not in the nursery, and I did not want him to be lonely." His lordship said, "Ah." He rose. He walked around the desk. He crouched in his good coat, which had come back from the tailor only that morning, to be on a level with Perrin. He looked into the bowl. He said, "This is a fine frog." Perrin said, "He is called Barnabas." His lordship said, "Barnabas is a name of substance." Perrin said, "Yes." His lordship said, "I think Barnabas would do best in the pond by the yew-walk." Perrin considered. He said, "But then he will be far from me." His lordship said, "That is the nature of ponds." Perrin considered further. He said, "Will you come with me to put him back?" His lordship glanced at Isolde. Isolde inclined her head, very slightly. His lordship said, "I will, if Mr. Bligh will excuse me for 10 minutes." Mr. Bligh, who had a granddaughter Perrin's age, and had once, in his own study, negotiated with a hedgehog, said, "My lord, I will excuse you for 20. They went out, the tall man and the small boy and the frog in the bowl, and Isolde, at the window, watched them go along the gravel toward the yew-walk, and she saw his lordship shorten his stride to match the boy's without appearing to shorten it, and she thought, "Damn you," and she thought, "Welcome home," and she thought both of these things at once and did not choose between them. That evening he said, at dinner, "The boy is Mrs. Owen's grandson." She said, "Yes," he said, "his mother." She said, "In the north." "Nursing," he said, "and his father." She said, "At sea. Since October." He said, he said, "I did not know we kept a child." She said, "We did not. Until we did." He said, "That is fair." He said, "He is a good boy." She said, "He is." He said, "I liked him." She said, "He liked you." He said, "He will not always." She said, "No." He said, "But today he did." She said, "Today he did." In the second week of his return, a letter came. Isolde saw it before he did, because the post came, by long habit, first to her in the small library, where Mrs. Owen had learned to bring it on a silver salver with the seals up. The salver had, that morning, 3 letters. 2 were for the estate. 1 was for him, and was in a hand she had never seen before, and was sealed with a plain wafer, and smelled, very faintly, of a scent she recognized, because a maid in a house on the coast had a sister who had once, on her half-day, walked past a cottage 1/2 a mile from a house he had taken, and had, at the window, seen a young woman with dark hair. Isolde set the letter aside. She did not open it. She was not, she had decided some weeks earlier, going to be a woman who opened her husband's letters, not because she thought it wrong in principle, but because she did not wish to become the sort of person for whom it was possible. She rang for Mrs. Owen and asked that the letter be given to his lordship at his convenience. Mrs. Owen took the letter without expression and went out. Isolde returned to the ledger. She was aware of her own heart in a way she disliked, and she made her hand steady on the pen by an act of will, and after 20 minutes she was, again, only balancing columns. He came to the small library at noon. He had the letter in his hand. He closed the door behind him, which he had not, since his return, done in this room. He said, "May I speak?" She set the pen down. She blotted. She closed the ledger. She said, "Yes," he said, "this is from a person whose name I will tell you if you wish to hear it, and whose existence you already know, because I am a fool, but I am not a fool enough to imagine that a house is a place where secrets travel slowly." She said, "I know of her existence." He said, "Yes." He said, "This letter tells me that she is well, that she has left the coast, that she has gone to her aunt in a town 4 counties east, that she does not intend to write again, and that she wishes me a great many things, most of them kinder than I deserve." She said, "I see." He said, "I will read it to you if you like." She said, "No." He said, "I will burn it if you like." She said, "No." He said, "Then what?" She said, "Keep it." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because a man who burns a letter to please his wife has learned nothing. A man who keeps a letter and does not answer it has begun, perhaps, to learn something." He was quiet. He said, "That is a hard sentence." She said, "It is meant to be." He said, "May I sit?" She said, "Yes." He sat. He put the letter on the small table between them, seal up, and did not touch it again. He said, "I will not lie to you about her." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I will not tell you about her either, unless you ask, because I do not think it would help you to know, and I do not think it would help me to tell." She said, "That is agreed." He said, "I will tell you one thing, because it is not about her, it is about me." She said, "Go on." He said, "I went south in October because I was afraid." She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of you." She looked at him. He said, "Of the fact that I did not then know how to be in a room with you without disappointing you, and I had begun to be a man who preferred rooms in which he did not have to try." She said, "Ah," he said, "that is not an excuse." She said, "No." He said, "It is a description." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have thought a great deal, on the road, about the difference between a description and an excuse." She said, "And," he said, "and I would like, if you will permit it, to be a man who offers descriptions in this house and excuses nowhere." She said, "That is a large ambition." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will permit it." She said, "I will hold you to it." He said, "Please do." Then, because she was a woman who had learned, over a winter, the value of turning a difficult conversation before it became a habit, she picked up the pen again, and she said, "The North Lodge." He said, "Yes." She said, "The roof." He said, "I looked yesterday. It will not last another winter." She said, "No." He said, "I will have it done in May." She said, "June. May is planting." He said, "June. Then," she said. "Good." She opened the ledger. He rose. At the door he paused, and without turning he said, "Isolde." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for not opening the letter." She said, "I did not open it because I did not wish to be the sort of woman who opens letters, not because I trusted you." He said, "Understood." He went out. The letter stayed on the table between them for 3 days. On the 4th day it was gone, and she did not ask where, and he did not say. In its place, on the 5th day, was a small sprig of yew from the walk by the pond where Barnabas the frog had been returned to his kin, laid, without comment, on the corner of the ledger. She left it there. It dried over the following week into a stiff green thing, and when at last she moved it, it left a faint mark on the leather, and she did not, when she noticed the mark, try to rub it out. The child grew. Spring did what spring does. The hawthorn came out in the hedges, first as a rumor and then as a fact, and the lambs in the low field learned to run, which is the funniest thing lambs do. Isolde walked every morning, on the arm of Tam, or when Tam was busy, on the arm of Perrin, who took the responsibility with tremendous seriousness and who had, by the end of April, developed the habit of announcing, at unpredictable intervals, that there was a stone ahead, my lady, or a root, my lady, or a bee, my lady, which is not dangerous, but is loud. His lordship rode out at dawn and returned by 9, and took breakfast with her, and read the newspapers aloud to her when she asked, which she began, after the 3rd week, to ask him to do because his reading voice was. She remembered one of the things she had liked about him in the first year, before liking had become a discipline. He read well. He read the parliamentary reports without editorializing, which she appreciated. He read the shipping notices, and did not, when he came to a ship called the Halcyon, which had put in at the port he had spent the winter near, betray any change of pace, and she noted the not betraying, and counted it, again, privately, in his favor. She was aware, in a way she had not been aware in October, of counting things privately in his favor. She was aware that a woman does not do such counting for a man toward whom she is indifferent. She did not, yet, tell him this. In the last week of April, a rider came from the east, splashed to the knees, with a letter from Isolde's sister, who lived a day's ride away in a smaller house with a larger husband and 4 children under 7, and who wrote, in her usual scrawl, that she was coming, that she would not be dissuaded, that she wished to see with her own eyes that Isolde was well, and that she was bringing only the youngest, who was still at the breast and could not be left, and the nurse, who was excellent, and one trunk, which was a lie. The sister, whose name was Perpetua, and who had been called Petty since she was 3, arrived in a coach with 2 trunks, and the youngest and the nurse, and a small dog of indeterminate breed which she had, she claimed, acquired at an inn along the way, and had not been able to leave behind. She swept into the hall with the youngest on her hip and the dog under her arm, and looked at Isolde, and burst, briefly and without warning, into tears, and then said, "Do not tell me anything until I have had tea," and Isolde, who loved her sister without illusion, took her into the small library and gave her tea, and Petty looked at her over the rim of the cup, and said, "Well, well," said Isolde. Petty said, "You look magnificent." Isolde said, "I look enormous." Petty said, "That is what I said." Isolde said, "And how is Rufus?" Petty said, "Rufus is Rufus. He sends his love and a barrel of cider and a very tedious letter for his lordship about drainage, which I am told is a subject of great interest in this house at present." Isolde said, "It is." Petty said, "And his lordship." Isolde said, "Is here." Petty said, "I know he is here. I saw his boots in the hall. I mean, how is he?" Isolde said, "He is trying." Petty said, "Is he?" Isolde said, "Yes." Petty said, "And are you?" Isolde said, "I am also trying." Petty said, "At what?" Isolde said, "At deciding whether trying is enough." Petty said, "Ah," she drank her tea. She said, "I will tell you what I think, though you have not asked." Isolde said, "You always do." Petty said, "I think that a man who leaves in October and comes back in March and finds his wife pregnant and does not, in the first hour, ask an ugly question, is a man who has done at least one thing correctly." Isolde said, "He asked it. In his way." Petty said, "In his way is not the same as allowed. Allowed would have been unforgivable. In his way is only human." Isolde said, "That is a generous distinction." Petty said, "I am a generous woman." Isolde said, "You are not." Petty said, "I am, on Tuesdays." Isolde laughed, which she had not, she realized, done in this room since October, and Petty heard the laugh and said nothing, because Petty, for all her noise, knew when not to make more. His lordship joined them for dinner. He was courteous to Petty, who was courteous back for the first 4 minutes, and then, having decided he was, at present, on probation but not in disgrace, began to tease him, gently, about his hair, which was still too long at the collar, and about the drainage letter from Rufus, which she had read on the coach and pronounced tedious even by Rufus's standards. His lordship bore the teasing with what Isolde recognized as relief. A man who has been walking on eggshells is grateful, sometimes, for a woman who cracks a few. After dinner, Petty went up to her room to feed the youngest, and his lordship and Isolde were left alone in the small drawing room with the fire and the spaniel and the last of the light on the yew. He said, "Your sister is a force." She said, "She is." He said, "She does not like me." She said, "She does not, yet know whether to like you." He said, "That is fair." She said, "She will decide by Sunday," he said, "and if she decides against." She said, "Then you will have to earn her again, which will be tiresome for you but instructive." He said, "And if she decides for?" She said, "Then you will have made an ally who will defend you to Rufus, which is worth a great deal." He said, "And to you?" She said, "Petty does not defend anyone to me. She only tells me the truth as she sees it, which is why I keep her." He said, He said, "May I ask something?" She said, "One thing." He said, "When you are ready to tell me, I would like to know what you did all winter that put that steadiness in your voice when you speak of the estate." She said, "I worked." He said, "I know. But what?" She said, "Another night." He said, "Another night." He rose. He said, "Good night, Isolde." She said, "Good night." At the door he paused. He said, "The child moved today." She looked at him. He said, "When I put my hand on your back at the top of the stair." She said, "Yes." He said, "I felt it." She said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." He went out. She sat with the spaniel a while longer, and the spaniel, who was old and had opinions, put its head on her foot and sighed, and she thought, "We are, all of us, trying." In the 3rd week after his return, on a soft gray morning that smelled of turned earth, a boy came running from the home farm with a message that one of the plow horses had gone down in the yard and was thrashing, and his lordship went out at a run without his coat and did not come back for 4 hours. When he came back, he was mud to the elbows and had a cut on his cheek from a hoof and a look on his face Isolde had not seen before, which was the look of a man who has been useful with his hands. The horse had been got up. The horse would live. He washed at the pump in the yard rather than tracking mud through the house, and he came into the small library in his shirt sleeves with his hair wet and sat down opposite her without asking, and she poured him tea without asking, and they sat that way for some time without speaking. At last he said, "I had forgotten." She said, "Forgotten what?" He said, "That I like this." She said, "This," he said, "being of use in the yard. Being asked to, being needed for something a man cannot pay another man to do quickly enough." She said, He said, "When I was a boy I spent more time in the yard than in the house." She said, "I did not know that." He said, "My father did not approve." He said the yard was for the yard men. He said, "And I, in October, was becoming my father." She said, "In what way?" He said, "In the way of a man who chooses rooms where he does not have to be useful." She said, He said, "I do not wish to be my father." She said, "Then do not be." He said, "It is not so simple." She said, "No, but it begins by not being." He said, "Yes." He drank his tea. He said, "Isolde." She said, "Yes." He said, "May I put my hand on your back again?" She said, "Why?" He said, "Because when I did it at the stair, I felt, for a moment, that I was in the right room, in the right house, at the right hour, and I would like to feel that again." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Come here." He came. He knelt beside her chair, which she had not asked him to do, and he put his hand, carefully, low on her back where the ache had lived for a week, and he pressed, gently, with the flat of his palm, and the ache eased, and she closed her eyes, and the child obligingly turned, and he felt it turn, and he did not say anything, which was, she thought, the correct thing not to say. After a while she said, "That is enough." He took his hand away. He rose. He went back to his chair. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." He said, "I would like, if you will permit it, to do that again, at times, in the weeks ahead." She said, "At times." He said, "At your invitation." She said, "At my invitation." He said, "Understood." Petty came in then, with the youngest on her hip, and looked at the two of them, and at the mud on his boots by the door, and at the tea things, and said, "Well, whatever this is, carry on. I am only passing through," and swept out again, and Isolde and his lordship looked at each other, and both at once laughed, and it was the first time they had laughed in the same room since a September night 4 years earlier, when a candle had gone out in the middle of a toast, and everyone at the table had, for reasons that were not really funny, laughed for a full minute. She remembered that night. She had not, until this moment, allowed herself to remember it. She remembered that she had liked him. Then she remembered that he had liked her. She remembered that liking had not been enough to save them in October from becoming strangers, but that it had, evidently, not been used up, only put down and forgotten, like a book on a shelf in a room one has stopped entering. Petty, from the corridor, called. And by the way, Rufus has written again, and this letter is even more tedious than the last. And his lordship called back, "Send it in," and Petty called back, "I will not. I will burn it as an act of mercy." And Isolde thought, "We are going to be all right." She did not say it aloud. She was not yet ready to say it aloud, but she thought it, and she let herself think it, and she did not, afterward, take it back. The child came in the last week of July, on a night of thunder, 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had predicted, and 2 days later than Isolde herself had privately guessed. The house was ready. The house had been ready for a month, because Mrs. Owen had a horror of being caught short, and Tam had a horror of Mrs. Owen being disappointed, and the two of them had, between them, laid in linens and lavender and small useful things enough to equip a small hospital. The midwife came in the afternoon, in her cloak, with her bag, and looked at Isolde and said, "My lady, tonight." And Isolde said, "Tonight." And the midwife said, "Yes." And Isolde said, "Then let us be sensible." And the midwife said, "We shall." His lordship was in the yard when the message reached him. He had been mending a gate with the head groom, which he had insisted on doing himself because the gate had annoyed him for a week, and he had wanted, he said, to know it beaten. He came into the house at a run, and Tam met him on the stair and said, "My lord." "Not yet." And he stopped. And he said, "When?" And Tam said, "Hours yet, my lord. She is comfortable. She is asking for you, but only to speak, not to be with." And he said, "I understand." And he went to the door of her room, and he knocked. And she called from within, "Come in." And he came in. She was sitting up in the wing chair by the window, in her wrap, with her feet on the low stool, and her hair loose, and a book she was not reading open in her lap, and outside the window the sky was the color of a bruise, and the yew-walk was going dark. He said, "My lady." She said, "My lord." He said, "May I sit?" She said, "Yes." She said, "I have 3 things to tell you, and I would like to tell them now, in case I forget them later, because I am told one forgets a great deal on a night like this." He said, "Tell me." She said, "1. If it is a boy, I would like him called Aldous, for my father." He said, "Done," she said. 2. If it is a girl, I would like her called Marian, for your mother." He said, "My mother." She said, "Yes." He said, "My mother did not, I think, love me well." She said, "No, she loved you badly, and she loved you honestly, and she was, in her way, a woman who tried, and I did not know her long, but I remember that she once, at a table full of people who were being unkind to me, said a single sentence that made them stop, and I have not forgotten it." He said, "What did she say?" She said, "My daughter-in-law is not a subject." He was quiet. He said, "I did not know that." She said, "No, she did not tell you." She told me, later, that she had considered it a small thing. It was not a small thing. He said, "Marian, then." She said, 3. She paused. She said, "I have not yet decided whether I love you again." He said, "I understand." She said, "I am telling you now, because tonight I may say things I do not mean, or things I do mean and would not. In ordinary hours, say, whatever I say tonight, in the room, in the pains, is not the answer to that question. The answer to that question will come later, in daylight, when I am well, and it will come from me, deliberately, and I will speak it to you in this chair, or one like it, and you will know it is the answer, because I will say, 'This is the answer.'" He said, "Understood," she said. "Do you agree?" He said, "I agree." She said, "Good." She said, "Now go and eat something, because Mrs. Owen will not let you into the room later if you have not, and I will not have you fainting on the boards." He said, "Yes, my lady." He rose. At the door he paused. He said, "Isolde." She said, "Yes." He said, "Whatever you say tonight, and whatever you say later, I am not going anywhere." She said, "I know." He went out. The night was as nights of that kind are. There was thunder, there was rain against the window, and then, later, no rain, and then, later, rain again. There was Mrs. Owen, who did not sit down for 6 hours. There was Tam, who held Isolde's hand and did not once look away from her face. There was the midwife, who was calm as a stone in a stream. There was Petty, who had refused to leave the house and had installed herself in the corridor outside, with the youngest asleep on her shoulder and the small dog in her lap, and had, at intervals, put her head around the door to say something bracing and then withdraw. There was his lordship, who did not, at first, come in, and who then, at Isolde's request, in an hour when the pains had shifted from a rhythm to a fact, was brought in and stood at the head of the bed, and gave her his hand, and did not speak, only held, and did not flinch when she gripped hard enough to leave marks he would find in the morning and not mention. There was, at 3:30, a cry. It was not the mother's. It was thin and outraged and entirely certain of itself, and it broke the room open. The midwife said, "A girl, my lady, and a fine one," and Isolde said, "Marian and his lordship," who had not until that moment made a sound, made one, small, that he did not try to disguise. They put the child on Isolde's chest. Isolde looked at her. She was red and cross and had a great deal of dark hair and was, unmistakably, her own person. Isolde said, "Hello," she said. "We have been waiting for you." She said, "You are welcome here." She looked up at his lordship. She said, "Come and see." He came. He looked. He said, "Oh." He said, "Oh." He put out one finger. The child, without opening her eyes, closed her fist around it. He did not speak for some time. When he did, he said, "Thank you." Isolde was not sure whether he was speaking to her or to the child or to something beyond them both, and she did not, then, ask. It broke quietly. Whatever had been held between them all spring, Whatever had been rehearsed and withheld and counted and not counted broke quietly there at the head of the bed, in the smell of lavender and rain. And neither of them named it. It was enough that it broke. They named her Marian at the font in the small chapel 3 weeks later, on a morning so clear it seemed indecent. Petty stood as godmother. Rufus stood as godfather. Perrin, who had been given, without discussion, the office of holding the christening cloth, discharged it with tremendous seriousness, and only once had to be reminded not to sniff it. The child, who had in 3 weeks become a considerable personage, slept through the ceremony and woke only to be affronted by the water, and expressed her affront in the family voice, which was, Petty declared, unmistakable. Afterward there was cake in the small dining room, because the long one was still cold even in August, and there were tenants at the door with small offerings. And there was a barrel of cider from Rufus, and there was, from Mr. Bligh, a very fine wooden rattle carved by his daughter, and there was, from Tam, a tiny cap of embroidered linen that had, Isolde knew, taken her 3 months of evenings, and there was, from his lordship, laid on the pillow of the cradle, without ceremony, a small book bound in green leather in which he had, over the summer, in a hand she had not known was his, written down the story of the West Field and the drainage of it, and the woman who had ordered it drained, so that the child, when she was old enough to read, would know from whom she had inherited her hand for such things. Isolde found the book in the afternoon, when she went up to the cradle to look at the child, as she did, at that time, approximately every 20 minutes. She read the first page, she read the second, she closed the book. She sat down in the chair by the cradle, and she permitted herself, at last, the quarter hour of feeling she had timed by the clock in December, and this time she did not stop it at the quarter hour, but let it run on to a half, and then to a full. Because there was no ledger tonight that needed balancing, and no letter tonight that needed not to be opened, and no house tonight that needed to be, by her, held up alone. When she came down at last, her eyes composed and her face calm, he was in the small library with the spaniel on the rug, and he looked up when she came in, and he saw her face, and he did not ask. She sat down opposite him. She said, "This is the answer." He said, "Yes." She said, "I love you again." She said, "I do not love you the way I loved you at 19, because I am not 19, and neither are you, and the loving of 19 was a thing done in ignorance of what loving costs. I love you the way a woman loves a man she has decided, with her eyes open, to keep." He said, "That is a better love." She said, "It is a harder one." He said, "I know." She said, "Do not go south again without me." He said, "I will not go south again at all, unless you send me." She said, "I will not send you." He said, "Good." She said, "One more thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The letter from the coast." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is it still kept?" He said, "It is." She said, "May I ask where?" He said, "In the small drawer in this desk, under the ledger from 1809. She said, "I do not need to see it. I only wished to know that it was, still, kept." He said, "It is kept because you told me to keep it, and because I do not, now, ever again wish to be a man who burns things to please." She said, "Good." She said, "That is all." He said, "Then, may I say one thing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for coming down the stairs tonight and saying that sentence in this chair, exactly as you said you would." She said, "I keep my agreements." He said, "I know." Outside, the yew-walk was going gold in the late light, and somewhere in the house a small imperious voice was working itself up to a full complaint, and Mrs. Owen's tread was already on the stair, and Petty, from the drawing-room, was laughing at something Rufus had said, and the spaniel on the rug was sighing the sigh of a dog who has, at last, in the fullness of years, found the correct fire. Isolde looked at her husband. He looked at her. Neither spoke. It was enough that they did not need to. Mr. Bligh, some months later, would tell his own wife, over their own tea, that in all his years of stewardship he had never seen a house settle into itself as that one did in the autumn of that year, and his wife, who had known Isolde as a girl, would say, "That is because there is a woman in it who is minding it," and Mr. Bligh would say, "And a man learning to." The bailiff who had been replaced went, in the end, to a cousin in the north, and was said to have prospered modestly, which Petty pronounced the just fate of a man who had cheated a duchess mildly. The young woman on the coast was, after a decent interval, married to a music master in the town 4 counties east, and was, by all accounts, happy, and sang, on Sundays, in a small choir that was, according to a letter from an old friend of his lordship's, better than it had any right to be. Mrs. Owen's daughter came back from the north in the autumn, with the aunt not dead after all, and reclaimed Perrin, who was returned to her with reluctance on both sides, and a promise that he might, in summers, come back and take charge of Barnabas, who had, it turned out, cousins, Tam. 3 years later, was married from the house to the head groom's second son, and Isolde stood for her, and Tam, in her plain gray dress, cried more than the bride's mother, which Petty said was the correct order of things. Rufus, having sent over the years a great many letters on drainage, was in time appointed to a small committee on drainage, and was said, on this committee, to be the only sensible man, which was, Petty said, the first time anyone had ever accused him of it. Marian grew. Marian's brother, Aldous, followed her 2 years after, on a morning so ordinary that no one, afterward, could remember the weather. Marian's sister, Perpetua the younger, followed him. His lordship, in the end, did not become his father. Isolde, in the end, did not stop counting things privately in his favor, though she found, over the years, that she counted them less because she was surer of the total. And so the story ends where such stories end, in a room that is warm, with a fire that is doing its steady work, and a child asleep upstairs, and a man and a woman who have agreed, in daylight, in a chair, to keep each other. And now, my dear listener, if you have stayed with me this long by the fire, you will forgive an old storyteller for turning, at the last, from the tale to you. If you have ever been the one left in a house in October, quietly balancing the columns while the world assumed you could not. If you have ever done the hard, unshowy work of holding a life together while the person who was meant to hold it with you was elsewhere. If you have ever waited to see whether someone you once loved would come back not merely in body but in attention. And if you have ever had the strange, unlooked for grace of watching them try, in small, daily, wordless ways, to earn a place in a room they had left, then this story has been, in some measure, about you, and I hope it has sat gently. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the letter that was not opened? Was it the hand, low on the back, at the stair? Was it the frog in the bowl, or the sprig of yew on the ledger, or the sentence, "This is the answer," spoken in daylight in a chair? I would like, very much, to know. And if you have found a small comfort in sitting here, by this fire, with these people, for a little while, then draw your chair up again another evening, and I will have another story ready, and the fire will be lit. And the tea will be warm, and we will begin as we always begin, in the middle of a small charged moment, and see where it takes us. Sleep well, dear listener. The house is quiet, the child is asleep, the yew walk is going gold in the late light. And we, you and I, are, for tonight, exactly where we ought to be.